The winter night of February 27, 1943, was brutally cold in the mountains of southern Norway, where temperatures plunged well below zero and snow lay thick across the landscape that the Nazi occupation forces believed was impenetrable, but unreachable by Allied commandos or resistance fighters who might threaten the industrial complex that had become one of the most strategically important installations in Hitler's entire war machine. Deep in the Telemark region, perched on the edge of a steep gorge and protected by minefields, floodlights, guard posts, guard posts, and German soldiers who had been told that the facility they guarded was absolutely critical to the Reich's future, sat the Vemork hydroelectric plant, an industrial marvel that before the war had been one of the world's largest producers of heavy water, that mysterious substance whose chemical formula was almost identical to ordinary water, but whose properties made it uniquely valuable for nuclear research, specifically for the kind of nuclear research that might, if successful, produce atomic weapons that could incinerate entire cities and determine the outcome of World War II. On that frozen February night, 9 Norwegian commandos, who had been trained by British intelligence, who had parachuted into Norway weeks earlier and survived in the wilderness on minimal supplies while conducting reconnaissance, approached the Vemork plant through terrain the Germans had dismissed as impassable, prepared to execute one of the most daring and consequential sabotage operations in military history, a raid that would set back the German nuclear weapons program by months or years, that would force the Nazi regime to recognize that their atomic ambitions were vulnerable to Allied action, and that would ultimately contribute to ensuring that Adolf Hitler never acquired the atomic bomb that might have made Nazi victory possible, or at least prolonged the war with catastrophic consequences for humanity. To understand the significance of the Vemork raid and why heavy water was so important that both sides were willing to kill and die for control of it, we must understand the physics of nuclear fission and the requirements for building an atomic bomb. The discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 by German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, and its theoretical explanation by Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch, opened the possibility that the enormous energy locked inside atomic nuclei could be released through controlled chain reactions. When a uranium atom absorbs a neutron, it splits into smaller atoms, releasing energy and additional neutrons. If those neutrons strike other uranium atoms, they can cause additional fission events, creating a chain reaction that releases vast amounts of energy. This is the principle behind both nuclear reactors and nuclear weapons. However, making this work in practice requires solving several technical problems. Natural uranium consists primarily of uranium-238, which does not readily undergo fission, with only about 0.7% being uranium-235, which does fission easily. To build a bomb using natural uranium is extraordinarily difficult. One solution is to enrich the uranium, increasing the proportion of uranium-235, but this requires industrial facilities and processes that were barely feasible in the 1940s. Another solution is to use a moderator, a substance that slows down neutrons to speeds that make them more likely to cause fission in uranium-235. Several materials can serve as moderators, including graphite and heavy water. Heavy water, chemically designated as deuterium oxide or D2O, is water where the hydrogen atoms are replaced with deuterium, a heavier isotope of hydrogen that contains one proton and one neutron in its nucleus, instead of just one proton. Heavy water occurs naturally in tiny concentrations, roughly 1 part per 6,400 in ordinary water. To obtain significant quantities of heavy water requires processing enormous amounts of ordinary water through a complex separation process. In 1940, only a few facilities in the world could produce heavy water in industrial quantities, and the largest of these was the Vemork plant in Norway, which used the enormous electrical power from its hydroelectric generators to run electrolysis equipment that separated heavy water from ordinary water as a byproduct of fertilizer production. When Germany invaded and occupied Norway in April 1940, One of the first actions taken by German authorities was to seize control of the Vemork plant and dramatically increase heavy water production. The order came from the highest levels of German scientific and military leadership, from people who understood that heavy water might be the key to atomic weapons. German nuclear physicists, including Werner Heisenberg, who was leading the German atomic research program, believed that heavy water was essential for their reactor designs. Without sufficient heavy water, German experiments in achieving sustained nuclear chain reactions would fail, and without achieving chain reactions, there would be no atomic bombs. Allied intelligence, particularly British intelligence services, became aware of increased German interest in heavy water through multiple sources including Norwegian resistance contacts, decoded German communications, and reports from scientists who had fled occupied Europe. By 1942, British and American intelligence had concluded that Germany was pursuing an atomic weapons program, and that the Vemork heavy water production was central to that program. The conclusion was obvious and terrifying. The Vemork had to be destroyed or at least disabled before Germany could accumulate enough heavy water to build a working nuclear reactor that could produce plutonium for atomic bombs. The first attempt to destroy Vemork came in October 1942, when British Combined Operations planned Operation Freshman, an ambitious commando raid, using gliders towed by bombers to land British engineers near the plant. The operation was a catastrophic failure. The gliders crashed in the Norwegian mountains due to bad weather and navigation errors. The survivors were captured by German forces. In a violation of the Geneva Conventions, Hitler ordered that the captured commandos be executed, and they were shot or tortured to death by the Gestapo. The failure of Operation Freshman convinced British planners that a different approach was needed, one that relied on smaller numbers of highly trained commandos who could approach the target on foot through the wilderness that the Germans considered impassable. The planners turned to Norwegian volunteers who had escaped to Britain and been trained by the Special Operations Executive, the British organization responsible for sabotage, espionage, and supporting resistance movements in occupied Europe. These Norwegian commandos had the language skills, cultural knowledge, and survival expertise necessary for the mission. They could pass as locals if necessary, could navigate Norwegian terrain and survive Norwegian winters, and had powerful motivation to strike back against the German occupiers of their homeland. The operation was designated Gunnerside, named after a British estate where some of the planning took place. 9 commandos were selected for the mission. Joachim Ronneberg as leader, Knut Haukelid, Kasper Idland, Frederick Kaiser, Hans Storhaug, Berger Stromsheim, Leif Tronstad, who served as military advisor, and 4 others who had parachuted in earlier as part of an advanced team called Operation Grouse. These men underwent intensive training in sabotage techniques, weapons, survival skills, and the specific layout of the Vemork plant. They studied blueprints, memorized guard positions, and rehearsed the attack repeatedly on mock-ups. They were trained to use silent killing techniques, to move without detection, and to place explosive charges with precision. They knew that the mission was extraordinarily dangerous, that capture would mean torture and execution, and that success was far from guaranteed. The Gunnerside team parachuted into Norway on February 16, 1943, landing in the Hardangervidda Plateau, a vast wilderness of mountains, forests, and frozen lakes. They had to locate the grouse team that had been inserted months earlier and was surviving in the wilderness while conducting reconnaissance. After several days of difficult travel through brutal winter conditions, carrying heavy packs of equipment and explosives, the Gunnerside and grouse teams linked up. Together they finalized plans for the assault on Vemork. The target was the heavy water concentration cells, located in the basement of the Vemork facility, the equipment where heavy water was separated and stored. Destroying these cells would eliminate Germany's heavy water stockpile and shut down production for months. The plant was formidably defended. It sat on the edge of a 600-foot gorge with only a single bridge providing vehicle access. The bridge was heavily guarded and mined. The plant itself was surrounded by minefields, barbed wire floodlights, and guard posts. German security had been significantly increased after the failed Operation Freshman. The facility was considered impregnable. The Norwegian commandos identified a weakness: the gorge side of the plant, precisely because it was a sheer cliff considered impassable, was less heavily guarded. If they could descend into the gorge, cross the partially frozen river at the bottom, and climb up the other side to the plant, they might approach without being detected. It would require mountaineering skills, physical endurance, and extraordinary luck, but it was possible. On the night of February 27th, the commandos moved into position. They descended into the gorge in darkness, a terrifying climb down ice-covered rocks, where a single mistake would mean a fatal fall. They crossed the river, breaking through ice and wading through freezing water that could cause hypothermia within minutes. They climbed the opposite cliff, using whatever handholds they could find, sometimes pulling each other up, until they reached the railway tracks that ran to the plant. They cut through a fence and approached the facility buildings. The assault team, led by Ronneberg, entered the plant through a basement entrance they had identified from blueprints. They moved through the facility silently, encountering minimal resistance because the Germans had not expected anyone to approach from the gorge side. A Norwegian guard working for the Germans was encountered and subdued without alarm being raised. The commandos located the heavy water concentration cells in the basement, exactly where intelligence had indicated. They placed explosive charges on the equipment, set with short fuses, to allow them time to escape, but not enough time for Germans to defuse them. The demolition was meticulously planned. The charges had to be placed to destroy the concentration cells and the pipes containing heavy water without causing unnecessary casualties or damage to the rest of the plant, which employed Norwegian workers. This was sabotage, not terrorism. The goal was to destroy German heavy water production while minimizing harm to Norwegian civilians. The explosives were positioned, the fuses were lit, and the commandos withdrew, moving quickly but quietly back toward the gorge. The charges detonated at approximately 1 a.m. with a massive explosion that shattered the concentration cells, destroyed equipment, and allowed roughly half a ton of heavy water to drain away and be diluted into the facility's water systems. The explosion triggered alarms throughout the facility. German guards rushed to investigate. Floodlights blazed, but the commandos were already gone, disappearing into the night, descending back into the gorge, and vanishing into the Norwegian wilderness. The German response was immediate and massive. The occupation authorities, realizing that something critical had been attacked, launched a huge manhunt. Thousands of German soldiers swept through the region. Helicopters and aircraft searched from above. Norwegian civilians were interrogated. Anyone suspected of resistance activity was arrested. Rewards were offered for information. But the commandos evaded all pursuit. Some skied hundreds of miles to neutral Sweden. Others went into hiding among the Norwegian population or joined resistance groups in the mountains. Remarkably, all of the Gunnerside and Grouse team members survived the mission and the subsequent escape, an almost miraculous outcome for an operation so dangerous. The damage to the German heavy water program was severe and immediate. The Vemork plant's production capacity was destroyed. The stockpile of heavy water that had been accumulated over months was lost. German nuclear scientists, who had been planning experiments that required this heavy water, found their work delayed indefinitely. Werner Heisenberg and the German atomic research team, already struggling with organizational problems, resource shortages, and the emigration of many of Germany's best physicists, who were Jewish or anti-Nazi, now faced the additional setback of losing their primary heavy water source. The German response revealed how important they considered the heavy water to be. Instead of abandoning the Vemork facility, the Germans immediately began repairs and reconstruction, pouring resources into getting heavy water production restarted. By autumn 1943, The plant was again producing heavy water, though at reduced capacity. This determination to continue despite the sabotage proved to Allied intelligence that the Germans remained committed to their nuclear program and that further action would be necessary. The next phase of the campaign against German heavy water came in November 1943, when the U.S. Army Air Force conducted a massive bombing raid against Vemork. Over 140 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers attacked the facility in daylight, dropping hundreds of tons of high explosives. The raid caused significant damage to the plant and surrounding areas, but the heavy water production equipment in the basement, protected by thick concrete, largely survived. The bombing did kill numerous Norwegian civilian workers, a tragic cost that the sabotage operation had successfully avoided. The raid demonstrated Allied determination to stop German heavy water production but also showed the limitations of strategic bombing against hardened targets. By early 1944, the Germans concluded that continuing heavy water production in Norway was too vulnerable to Allied interference. They decided to move the remaining heavy water and production equipment to Germany, where it could be better protected and integrated into German nuclear research facilities. This decision created one final opportunity for sabotage. The heavy water would have to be transported by ferry across Lake Tinn, a deep lake in southern Norway. If the ferry could be sunk in the deepest part of the lake, the heavy water would be lost forever. Too deep to salvage. Knut Haukelid, one of the original Vemork saboteurs, who had remained in Norway organizing resistance activities, was tasked with this mission. In February 1944, Haukelid and other resistance fighters infiltrated the ferry Hydro and placed time-delayed explosive charges in its hull, set to detonate when the ferry reached the deepest part of Lake Tinn. On February 20, 1944, the ferry departed with its cargo of heavy water barrels, German guards, and Norwegian civilian passengers. The charges exploded as planned, sinking the ferry in over 1,300 feet of water. 14 Norwegian civilians died in the sinking, a terrible cost that weighed heavily on Haukelid and the resistance. But the heavy water was lost, settling to the bottom of the lake where it remains to this day. The cumulative effect of these operations, the Vemork sabotage, the bombing raid, and the Go ferry sinking, was to effectively end German access to significant quantities of heavy water. Without heavy water, the German nuclear program could not proceed along the experimental pathways that scientists like Heisenberg had planned. Combined with other factors, including the strain on German resources from fighting a total war on multiple fronts, the disorganization of German nuclear research, which was divided among competing institutions and personalities, and the emigration of many of Germany's best nuclear physicists, the loss of heavy water meant that Germany never came close to building an atomic bomb. The question of how close Germany actually came to atomic weapons is complex and debated by historians. Post-war interrogations of German scientists, examination of German nuclear research facilities captured by Allied forces, and analysis of German wartime records revealed that the German program was far behind the Manhattan Project. German scientists had not solved many of the theoretical and practical problems necessary for building atomic bombs. They lacked the industrial infrastructure to produce weapons-grade uranium or plutonium. They had not achieved sustained nuclear chain reactions. Some historians argue that even without Allied sabotage and bombing, Germany would not have produced atomic weapons before the war ended. Others contend that Germany was on a research path that might have succeeded if given more time and resources, and that the sabotage operations bought crucial months or years that ensured Germany never acquired the bomb. What is certain is that Allied intelligence at the time believed the German nuclear threat was real and serious enough to justify extraordinary measures, including sabotage operations that cost lives. The Norwegian commandos who executed the Vemork believed they were preventing Hitler from acquiring atomic weapons. Whether that belief was entirely accurate or somewhat exaggerated, their actions did objectively set back German nuclear research, did eliminate Germany's primary heavy water source, and did contribute to ensuring that Nazi Germany never exploded an atomic device. The Vemork sabotage became one of the most celebrated commando operations of World War II. The participants were decorated by multiple governments. Joachim Ronberg, the mission leader, was awarded the Distinguished Service Order by Britain and became a Norwegian national hero. The operation was studied in military schools as an example of how small, highly trained units could achieve strategic effects through precise action. It demonstrated the value of special operations forces, the importance of intelligence in identifying critical vulnerabilities, and the effectiveness of supporting resistance movements in occupied territories. For German prisoners of war, and later for the German public learning, after the war about how the Vemork raid had destroyed their heavy water production, the revelation was another piece of evidence about how comprehensively Germany had been outmaneuvered by Allied intelligence and special operations. The fact that Norwegian commandos trained by the British could infiltrate deep into occupied Norway, attack one of the most heavily guarded facilities in the country, destroy critical equipment, and escape without casualties, said something profound about German security failures and about the effectiveness of Allied special operations. But the raid had specifically targeted and successfully destroyed heavy water production, thereby hampering German nuclear research, demonstrated that Allied intelligence understood German scientific programs and could act decisively to counter them. The heavy water raids also highlighted the moral complexity of resistance and sabotage operations. The initial Vemork sabotage was executed with care to minimize civilian casualties and succeeded in destroying the target while killing no one. The bombing raid that followed killed Norwegian workers, demonstrating the terrible costs of strategic bombing. The ferry sinking killed Norwegian civilians, including women and children, a tragedy that haunted the saboteurs, but which they judged necessary to prevent the heavy water from reaching Germany. These operations forced participants and planners to make terrible calculations about acceptable costs, about whether preventing potential German atomic weapons justified actions that would certainly kill some innocent people. The Norwegian resistance fighters who executed these missions carried the psychological burden of these decisions for the rest of their lives. The Vemork raid has been dramatized in films, books, and documentaries, most notably in the 1965 film The Heroes of Telemark, starring Kirk Douglas, and more recently in television series and historical accounts that attempt to separate myth from reality. Like many celebrated wartime operations, the story has been embellished over decades of retelling, with some accounts exaggerating the danger, the German nuclear progress, or the raid's impact. Historical research based on German records captured after the war has provided a more nuanced picture of both the German nuclear program's actual state and the raid's effects, but this has not diminished the fundamental significance of what the Norwegian commandos accomplished. The broader campaign against German heavy water, including the Vemork sabotage, the bombing raids, and the ferry sinking, represented a successful application of intelligence, special operations, and strategic bombing in combination to neutralize a potential strategic threat. It showed that even in total war, discriminate action by small, highly skilled units could sometimes achieve effects that massive conventional forces could not. It demonstrated the value of supporting resistance movements in occupied territories, as the Norwegian resistance provided intelligence, logistical support, and personnel that were essential to the operation's success. And it proved that determination to prevent enemy technological breakthroughs could motivate extraordinary heroism and sacrifice from individuals who understood that the stakes extended far beyond any single battle or campaign. The German nuclear program, already struggling with organizational dysfunction, resource constraints, and the loss of many of Germany's best scientists, never recovered from the loss of heavy water production at Vemork. While other factors certainly contributed more substantially to German failure to develop atomic weapons, the Norwegian commando raids ensured that one potential pathway to German nuclear success was closed off decisively. The 9 men who skied through the frozen Norwegian wilderness, descended an icy gorge in darkness, infiltrated a supposedly impregnable facility, and destroyed the heavy water equipment with precisely placed explosives, had performed an operation whose strategic importance extended far beyond the physical damage they inflicted, sending a message to Germany that Allied intelligence knew about German nuclear ambitions and would stop at nothing to prevent Hitler from acquiring atomic weapons, while demonstrating to the world that courage, skill, and determination could sometimes change the course of history more effectively than entire armies.